I don't see any names listed.
Oh, I see them.
Oh, so you'll be able to see if they raise their hands or not.
Yeah, do you want to be host for now?
You can just look,
Okay, I am live on Zoom. Got it. Okay, there are some people watching on YouTube too. We're going to get started in just about a minute. I believe people are still joining in. So Kathy, do you, for your announcement, do you want to be the host or?
No, that's okay.
That's okay, because I do see all the participant names here.
Yeah, you can just look at
the
raised hands.
Yeah, we have about 19 people who are signed in right now.
It says 23 as a number.
That includes the three.
That includes us. Okay.
So now it's 24 because we have people still joining in.
Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to start now. So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Ravina Nimbalkar, and I'm the Executive Director at NAMI Santa Clara County. Before we begin the general meeting, I just want to give some updates at NAMI Santa Clara County. So all our programs have been virtual since the pandemic began. Our warm line is up and running from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Fridays via phone as well as email. And we have after-hour family support, which is available on evenings and weekends. Support groups are all listed on our website. Our website is www.namisantaclara.org and offered over Zoom. Our educational classes are ongoing on Zoom as well. And to get more information about when the next class is, please call our warm line number, which is 408-453-0400, and you can select option number 1. They'll be able to give you details and put you on the wait list. The NAMI Basics program is an on-demand program, which is on our website, and you can take it on your pace. Similarly, the NAMI Homefront program as well. The next FaithNet training is on Thursday, March 31st at 11:30 a.m. You can call the warm line to get more information for that as well. The community peer program continues the matches via hospitals as well as self-referrals. I now would like to invite Kathy forward, former executive director and current consultant, to make an announcement. Kathy, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight. Every year we form a committee to look at board recruitment or board retention. And we're pleased to say that the slate for this coming year was published in our March newsletter. That would be President at Uday Kapoor, Vice Presidents Beverly Lozoff, Harold Brown, Juan Perez, and Frank Alioto. Our Treasurer, Steve Wade, and Secretary would be Peter Newman. Many of these have been board members for years, dedicated people. These are volunteer positions. And they meet monthly and also work on lots of different issues in the community. So I'd like to get a vote from all of you, and it's a little tricky over Zoom. So I believe you have a reaction button, or it says raise hand on the lower center part of your screen. So if you would click that button for a vote, if there are any comments or anything that anyone wants to say, you can put it in the chat. And so if you could do that now, I'd really appreciate that. And Ravina can see what's going on. I can't, but
I can, yeah. And I see that I see a lot of hands up.
Okay.
So I'm going to count about 13 hands up right now.
Okay.
And we have 27 attendees. So I'm just waiting for a majority here. Okay, we do have. So 15 hands.
Okay. All right. So we'll assume that the majority of membership is in favor of the slate of officers. And it will be at the April general meeting that we will actually do the installation of officers. And again, I believe this will be on Zoom, correct, Ravina?
Yes, it will.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your participation, and we're excited about our continuing board members and new ones. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kathy, and congratulations to the board. Okay, so coming back to our meeting. So today's topic is how different types of stressful experiences affect brain development and mental health in teens. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Rajpreet Chahal. Dr. Chahal is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychology at Stanford University. She earned her PhD at University of California, Davis, and is currently funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and the Kingstein Third Generation Foundation Fellow in Depression. Dr. Chahal is interested in understanding the roles of specific forms of stress, for example, abuse and economic disadvantage, on brain development and mental health. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Chahal, who also has a PowerPoint presentation to share. And I do want to mention that if you have any questions, we will take those questions at the end of the PowerPoint presentation, and feel free to write your questions in the Q&A section, or if it's easier for you, you can put in the chat. I'll be checking both. So thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Ravina. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, are you able to see this? Okay, great. Thank you for having me. Like Ravina said, I'm a postdoc working at Stanford's Department of Psychology, and today I'll be sharing some findings that we've had over the past year or a couple of years, looking at the effects of different types of stressful experiences on brain development, puberty, and mood during adolescence. So I'm going to try my best not to make this too technical, and I'll try and just give sort of overarching themes from my research that I think are applicable in understanding mental health during the teenage years. So I hope this is interesting for the audience today. So we know that mental health is declining, and this is especially true during the COVID-19 pandemic. But if I'm showing you sort of the trend in mental health over the past 10 years or so, here's a graph that shows adolescents and adults and the percentage of people who meet criteria for a major depressive episode within the past year. So here adolescents are 12 to 17-year-olds and adults are above 18. So this is the year 2010, and these rates are a little below 9% for adolescents and around 5% for adults. However, as the years went on, in 2017, that rate started to climb, and then finally at 2020, just as the pandemic was beginning, that rate really climbed for adolescents and a bit for adults as well. So that gap got larger between how often adolescents experience depression compared to adults. So now we're looking in 2020 at around almost an 18% incidence of depression, which is very high. And this is especially true when we're looking at sex differences. So in males, this is pre-pandemic, the rates were about 13.6% in the US, which is about 3.4 million males who met lifetime incidence of depression. And then for females, this was 36%. That's about 9 million teenage females who have met criteria for depression. And this is, again, pre-pandemic, and these levels have climbed in 2021, 2022. And when we look at anxiety disorders, we see a really similar spread. So females have about a 38% incidence and males have about 26%. So, there's very high levels of anxiety and depression in teenagers across the United States. And those levels continue to grow, and they especially grew during the pandemic. But we're seeing it's not just the pandemic, it was the past 10 years or so that we're seeing mental health is declining. So it's really important that we think about some of those factors that we can step in and intervene on to try and reduce these symptoms as early as possible. And that's the sort of work that I do. But what I'm really interested in is internalizing symptoms. So internalizing is a word we use to capture symptoms that include depression and anxiety. And it all sort of falls under what we call the internalizing umbrella. And this can include feelings of nervousness or irritability, changes in sleep or eating habits, more bodily sorts of symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, and physical symptoms, the feeling afraid or having concentration problems, reporting loneliness, feeling unloved and unwanted. So all of these sorts of symptoms, you know how typically if I'm talking about depression and anxiety, we might be thinking about clinical rates of those disorders. But for internalizing symptoms, we can look at sort of normative fluctuations. So how everybody sort of varies in these symptoms. And here's a graph showing that there's pretty high rates of these symptoms across teenagers. And this is from our study at Stanford. So these teens were not selected for meeting criteria for any disorder, but you can see that they're reporting feeling many of these sorts of internalizing symptoms at pretty high rates. I mean, close to 60% are saying that they sometimes feel nervous, have concentration issues, that they feel lonely and afraid. And then at a lower rate, but still pretty high, almost in the 20% to 30% rate, we're seeing that teens are reporting that they often have these internalizing experiences. So it's really important that we, like I said, that we look at factors that predict these symptoms, but also factors that would relate to resilience from these symptoms. And when I say resilience, I mean having the ability to stop these symptoms when they're occurring. So even at subclinical levels, so not even meeting criteria for depression or anxiety, higher internalizing symptoms during adolescence is associated with elevated symptoms in adulthood, poorer physical health, and higher levels of suicidal thoughts. So it's important we intervene as early as possible. And that's why I'm especially interested in the teenage years. And importantly, having elevated symptoms in adulthood is also predictive of early mortality, even if the person reports having pretty excellent physical health. So there are three aspects I'll talk about today that are related to internalizing symptoms. One is early life stress. So everybody experiences some levels of stress, but we know that having higher levels of stress is associated with higher risk for internalizing problems, and that some types of stress, including abuse and neglect, are more closely tied with mental health than others are. The other aspect that I'll talk to you about today that's important for teenagers and is related to mental health, but not talked about so often, especially more in like the public sphere, is puberty. So teenagers go through puberty and they experience changes in physical aspects of development, but also in hormonal changes and how they interact with their environment. So we've found in our research, and there's a lot of research to support this as well, that girls, especially who have earlier pubertal development, are at higher risk for internalizing problems during the teenage years. And we've also found that early life stress is predictive of earlier pubertal development. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. One part that I'm really interested in and will share about is brain development. So there's a lot of brain development happening during the teenage years, especially in the areas of the brain that are involved in cognitive control. And when I mean cognitive control, I'm talking about working memory, attention, the ability to stop yourself from doing something and instead working towards a goal. So that's inhibitory control. Our research is showing that parts of brain development are really varying based on early life stress experiences, and that brain development is also tied to pubertal development and to the risk for internalizing symptoms. But importantly, we're recently finding that there are aspects of brain development that actually protect an individual from developing depression or anxiety, even if they've experienced a lot of stress in their life. So going right into our study, our study is conducted at Stanford University, and we call it the Early Life Stress Study because we're interested in how different types of stressful experiences affect brain development, but also mental health during teenage years and adulthood. So in our first time point of data collection, our participants were 9 to 14 years old. And they completed an early life stress interview where they reported on any sorts of stressful experiences that they might have had in their lifetime. They also reported on symptoms, including depression and anxiety symptoms. And they reported on their subjective or how they felt that their pubertal development was going compared to their peers. But we also collected more objective measures like salivary hormones and the age of menarche, or the onset of the first period in females. And we also collected brain imaging, both looking at the structure of the brain, but also the function of different brain regions and how they interact with each other. And we collected this every 2 years. We're currently in our 4th time point of data collection, and our participants are about 15 to 21 years old right now. So we have this really rich data set that covers all of that time period from late childhood, or about 10 years old, into the early 20s. And this really well captures the whole phase of puberty as well. And we have 225 people who are enrolled in this study, and they're coming back every 2 years to provide all of these measures. Fortunately, we were able to recruit a really diverse sample that is representative of the Bay Area, specifically of Palo Alto. And I just want to talk really briefly about the way that we assess early life stress, or any sort of stressor. So we have what's called the traumatic event screening inventory. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing you all the different types of stressful experiences that the child might have gone through. And at the top, I'm showing the most frequently endorsed experiences, and at the bottom are those that are less frequently endorsed. So for example, witnessing a severe illness, or moving in and out, or seeing war or terrorism on TV is actually quite common. However, being kidnapped, witnessing sexual assault, or having experienced a threat of physical assault is a lot less common. Nonetheless, we ask children to report whether or not they've experienced any of these stressors, and then our panel of coders rates the severity of that stressor, going from 0, non-eventful or not stressful, to 4, really extremely impactful. And based on these sorts of different experiences, we can know a little bit about the specific types of stress that they might have had in their life. One that we're really interested in, that's sort of a new and less explored aspect of the research, is unpredictability. So these are stressful experiences that were unforeseen and that the person would not have predicted ahead of time. So this could be the death of someone close, separation from a family or a friend due to some sort of circumstance like legal issues or travel. Experiencing a disaster, or witnessing or experiencing an accident. And then the next one is threatening experiences that are stressful. So here we would ask the participant if they've ever experienced anything in the environment that might constitute a threat to them. So this would be things like a family verbal conflict that is involving violence, community violence, domestic violence, sexual abuse, physical abuse, just all those sorts of things that might be a potential threat to the child's life. And finally, we are also interested in deprivation as our third stressful measure. So this is actually more based on family economic disadvantage. So the parents reported highest education and their income to needs ratio. But we're also interested in neighborhood level factors of economic disadvantage. And we calculate that by looking at the addresses that the person reports living at. And then we use what's called the Cal EnviroScreen. It's a publicly available tool where we can look at the levels of poverty, housing burden, unemployment, all those sort of neighborhood variables that would give us an indication of economic status of the family. And really briefly, I won't go too deeply into this, but there are several brain networks that have been indicated in depression and anxiety, but there are 3 that I'm particularly interested in. One is called the frontal parietal network, which includes areas of the brain that are involved in cognitive control. Like I mentioned before, cognitive control encompasses things like attention and memory. that teenagers are continuing to develop during the adolescent years. The other is the default mode network. So these are brain regions that are involved in processing information about ourselves as well as others. And finally, the salience network. So this network actually integrates information from the default mode and frontal parietal networks to bring together sensory, emotional, and cognitive information. So it's sort of like our controller between different networks. And I'll be briefly talking about functional connections between these networks. And the way we look at that is by looking at patterns of activation across different brain regions. And if they're highly correlated, then we say that these brain regions are having high connectivity or that they're involved in similar functions. And then if they have low levels of correlation in their activity, then we say that they have low connectivity. And like I mentioned, these brain networks have been implicated in internalizing symptoms in teenagers. However, most of the research that's been conducted in the past has looked at a single snapshot in time. So they've looked at how these brain networks are different across people, for example, who are depressed versus not. However, there's very little research looking at how these brain networks develop during adolescence in the face of stress, or in order to predict things like depression and anxiety. So the first bit of research that we've recently published that I'll share with you is looking at different types of stressful experiences. Like I mentioned, threat, unpredictability, or deprivation, economic status. How do people differ in their brain development as a function of these different stressors? Well, one of the first questions we had was, do people who have these different stressful experiences vary in their internalizing trajectories? Remember, internalizing trajectories or internalizing symptoms include things like depression and anxiety symptoms. So here I'm showing you a few plots and I'll just summarize it for you. Those adolescents who had higher levels of unpredictable types of stressful experiences entered adolescence with higher levels of internalizing symptoms, and they remained higher over time. And you can see that by these red lines here, that already by age 10, these adolescents had higher levels of internalizing symptoms compared to their peers who didn't have much unpredictable, stressful experiences. And then they remained that way throughout adolescence. And we see a really similar phenomenon in kids who have experienced a lot of threatful experiences. So experiencing threatening types of stress in the environment is related to having higher levels of internalizing symptoms already at the start of adolescence and maintaining that throughout the teenage years. But we did not see that there was any difference among kids who had experienced higher socioeconomic disadvantage versus those who had lower socioeconomic disadvantage or higher deprivation. In terms of internalizing symptoms, they seem to be pretty similar, where they're showing sort of normative increases in symptoms over time. And then when we look at brain development, and I'll just summarize this quickly so that you're not overwhelmed. There's a lot of figures here, but when we're looking at the salience network, which I had mentioned before, and connections between the salience and default mode network, as well as between the frontal parietal and salience networks, we see that kids who had lower levels of unpredictability, indicated in the blue, showed decreases in connectivity over time. So their brains developed in a way where these connections between the brain networks that I mentioned decreased, indicating more efficient brains over time. But those who had higher levels of unpredictable types of stress actually did not show those decreases. They remained higher in connectivity over time. And we see a very similar pattern for those who experience threat-related stress. So none of those sort of normative decreases in brain network connectivity. But when we look at deprivation, we see that this is really widespread. So I'm showing here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different brain network patterns that are very different for folks who had higher levels of deprivation or more socioeconomic disadvantage compared to those who didn't have that disadvantage, who are indicated in the blue. And finally, in this paper, we showed that these brain development patterns that vary so much as a result of different types of stressful experiences actually are mediating or suggesting sort of a mechanism in maintaining these symptoms over time as well. And lots of graphs here as well, but we also wanted to know whether it's not just brain development, but is it also pubertal development, another type of biological change that occurs during the teenage years that might be affected by different types of stressful experiences. So indeed, we found that in females, having higher levels of deprivation was related to a higher initial adrenal status. So the girls are feeling like their pubertal development is happening at an earlier time compared to their peers who did not experience that deprivation-related stress. But we also found that for both males and females, those who come from neighborhoods or families with lower economic resources, they had steeper increases in BMI or body mass index over the course of adolescence. And in fact, by the time they were in late adolescence, shown here on the right in the pie charts, those children who came from high deprivation backgrounds had about a threefold higher increase in being classified as overweight. So this really speaks to the importance of thinking about interventions that are specific to the types of stressors that a person might experience. Here we're finding that nutritional education and access to better nutritional resources would be specifically very helpful for kids who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And we also found really interesting, if you're looking at the age of menarche, which is shown here at the right, so on the y-axis is the age of menarche, right? Having a younger age of menarche means that the person, had their period at an earlier time compared to their peers. And what we're finding is that those girls who had experienced higher threat-related stress in their environment had a much earlier age of menarche compared to their peers who did not experience that threat-related stress. And we're finding the same for unpredictability. So girls who have unpredictable forms of stress in their environment tend to have their period a lot earlier than those girls who had less unpredictability in their environment. And so what is it about stress and puberty that's so important? Well, like I mentioned before, puberty and being off time in pubertal development, because of those surge in hormones happening at an earlier time point, but also because people are feeling like they're developing faster than their peers, is related to mental health. So we found that in females, which are shown in the red at the top, these increases in pubertal measures, whether they're subjective puberty or hormones like testosterone, and DHEA, or even body mass index. Having increases in those pubertal measures is related to increases in internalizing symptoms like depression and anxiety, but only in females. And like I had mentioned earlier, having an earlier age of menarche, which would be here more on the left of the plot, is related to higher levels of internalizing symptoms compared to their peers who have menarche at later ages or their first period. However, when we look at males, we see the opposite direction. So having increases in their adrenal status is related to decreases in internalizing symptoms. So we're seeing this really different sex divergent pathway in how pubertal hormones and puberty contributes to our mental health in males versus females. So here's a little plot to sort of summarize what I've just shared. All these different kinds of stressful experiences, whether it's unpredictability, threat, or deprivation, are related to faster pubertal development in teenagers. However, only in females do we see that this faster rate of development is related to higher internalizing symptoms like depression and anxiety. In males, however, we don't see that effect. And in fact, we see that having higher pubertal or faster pubertal development is related to decreases in those symptoms. So a very strong difference here we're seeing in how males and females encounter stress, how it sort of embodies itself in physical development, and then in how that physical development relates to mental health. So that might help us to understand some of those sex differences that I had talked about in the beginning of this presentation in terms of how often we see depression in females versus males. Right before that, I had showed you another study that we conducted where we found that brain development also varies as a function of the types of stressful experiences that kids and teenagers have. So here I'm just showing the different brain networks that are affected by these different types of stressors. But overall, we're seeing that typical drop in connectivity that we would expect during the adolescent years doesn't happen for teenagers who have experienced higher levels of stressful experiences. And then that this brain development pattern is related to the maintenance of depression and anxiety symptoms. And something that I've been working on recently is to think about how our brains might tell us who's more or less susceptible to depression and anxiety. So we can do this using biotyping. So we can look at the brain and we can see whether there are patterns of brain activity that might differentiate different groups within our data. And then do those different groups vary in their current symptoms or their future symptoms? And this approach, we have actually, we've hypothesized that it's really important to use biotyping to break down this population into smaller samples or different subpopulations that then we can then assign different medications or interventions to. So a more personalized approach to mental health interventions and treatment of depression and anxiety is possible when we find brain signatures that are specific to different types of symptoms or trajectories of symptoms. And we've actually done this in our early life stress study. And we found that there are indeed brain biotypes that we can detect based on patterns of activity in the brain. And so here I'm showing on the left-hand side the different sorts of brain biotypes that we found, and each biotype is indicated by the colored lines going in between the different brain regions. And then on the right-hand side, I'm showing how each of these biotypes vary significantly in their trajectories of internalizing symptoms. So for example, here, if we're looking at the executive control network, which is involved in cognitive control, we found one group that is the dark gray biotype that has higher levels of symptoms at the start of adolescence, and they remain this way. They don't show any significant increases or decreases over time. However, the orange group entered adolescence with lower levels of symptoms that significantly increased over time. So to differentiate these two groups, we might label them as the gray group being early depression or childhood onset depression, whereas the orange group might be adolescent onset depression. So big differences in how symptoms change over time during the teenage years can be detected by simply looking at brain patterns and nothing else. And we've done this as well in a separate sample. Here, this was with a group of Mexican origin adolescents from the Sacramento area. And here we collected the brain imaging at age 16, and we used the same biotyping procedure. And we found two biotypes, one that I've indicated in this green panel and one in the blue panel. In the blue panel, you can see that there are a greater number of connections between different brain regions. So we labeled this the hyperconnected biotype. And you can see that when we look at prior symptoms, so when they were 14, their current symptoms at 16, and their future symptoms 2 years later at age 18, the hyperconnected biotype always has higher levels of internalizing symptoms, including depression and anxiety, compared to the green diffusely connected biotype. And again, We did not indicate any information about the symptoms here when we were running these analyses. They're completely based just on brain patterns. So these are just brain-based biotypes that give us ideas about the future symptoms, the past symptoms, and the current ones. And we've also shown this to be true when looking at structural connections in the brain. Here, instead of looking at the brain to do biotyping, we actually looked at symptom changes to do biotyping. So here we had participants, they were girls from the Pittsburgh area of Pennsylvania, and we looked at their symptoms over the course of 10 years from age 10 till 20. And we found that there was a group indicated in orange who had stable high symptoms, a group indicated in red that had escalating symptoms, and those in green who had stable low symptoms. And what's important to note here is that their brain signatures were significantly different. And really quickly, I just want to mention the idea of resilience. So not only can we look at risk factors that are related to depression and anxiety, we can also look at brain-related factors or environmental factors that might protect a person from stress or protect them from depression and anxiety. So in this study, we looked at how people, specifically adolescents, how their internalizing symptoms change from pre to during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, and this was the first study to show that teenagers indeed increased in internalizing symptoms from before the COVID-19 pandemic to during. And this is with a longitudinal sample. So we had asked participants about their levels of internalizing symptoms, including depression and anxiety, before the COVID-19 pandemic. It was about 3 months before. And we also asked them 2 weeks into the shelter in place in the Bay Area, which was about March 2020. And you can see there was significant increases in internalizing symptoms as reported by the teenagers. But what's really interesting is we also found that pubertal stage was a predictor of how much people were reporting increases. Specifically, youth who were further along in puberty reported greater increases in internalizing symptoms from before to during the pandemic. However, the brain gives us this really important information about who's resilient versus who's not to this puberty association with internalizing symptoms. What we found is that youth who had higher levels of functional connections in the brain of cognitive control regions that are indicated here in the red and the yellow, those youth had less increases over time. In fact, they showed no changes, that's indicated in the gray line. They showed no changes in symptoms from pre to during the pandemic. However, youth who had lower levels of connections in these brain regions showed that pattern of big increases in their symptoms from pre to during the pandemic. So this suggests to us that there's aspects of the brain that reflect resilience, even during really stressful periods of life. And one here that I'm very interested in is these cognitive brain regions, because cognition, things like memory and attention, they help us to navigate stressful situations. They help us to get through these periods of life where things are uncertain and we're not sure what's going to happen, like the beginning of the pandemic. Especially for teenagers, there were such huge changes to their daily lives. They were no longer in school, they were mostly at home, and social interactions are such a huge part of teenage quality of life. And without those social interactions in school and such uncertainty about their familial stability or what might happen next in terms of their health, it was indeed a really stressful time, the beginning of the pandemic and the rest of the pandemic. But those people who had higher levels of connections and brain regions involved in our ability to navigate stress were actually not showing changes in symptoms. So it's gotten me really interested in brain regions that are involved in cognitive control, which we know are developing during adolescence. And here I'm showing we've also found this in structural connections going from frontal brain regions to parietal regions, so parietal being more of the middle of the brain, And these structural connections are equally important and implicated in cognitive control. So here I'm showing that especially in females who are indicated in the turquoise color, that there were significant increases in depression symptoms, not only throughout adolescence, but especially from our last time point to during the COVID-19 pandemic. But we did not see that to be true for those who had high levels of structural connections, and these are white matter tracts in the brain, between these frontal brain regions that are involved in cognitive control. We only saw depression increases in those who had lower levels of structural connections in cognitive brain regions. So again, it's really important to think about brain regions as they reflect resilience, not just risk, because likely these connections are helping these individuals in navigating stress. And these are just plots showing that indeed having higher executive or cognitive control is really important for personality characteristics. So this is in adulthood. We found that adults who had lower levels of cognitive control had higher amounts of personality dysfunction and negative personality traits, including things like proneness to suicidal thoughts and self-harm, negative temperament. Some of those more commonly described personality characteristics like neuroticism and aggression, and those were also related to people's perceived levels of cognitive control, but also their actual levels as indicated by task. And more recently, and this is the last part that I'll share with you, is I've been thinking about if we were to put all of these variables, the brain, stressful experiences, puberty, and other demographic and environmental variables into the same model, which ones beat each other out in predicting mental health. And this is important to think about when we want to know about which factors we should really intervene on and focus on. And this takes us a step further into translating these findings. And what we found is that there are a few variables that are more strongly related to mental health than others are. And the top predictor in our machine learning models was unpredictable forms of stress. So again, those are those stressful experiences that are unforeseen and uncontrollable. Our second predictor was threatening types of stress. And both of those contributed to higher levels of depression and anxiety. However, what's indicated in these blue icons on the right, we also found that having higher levels of peer support was related to lower levels of internalizing symptoms. So peer support can really help in sort of reversing those negative aspects of stress. And again, like I had mentioned before, we found that connections between cognitive brain regions, having higher levels of connections, was related to lower levels of symptoms. However, faster puberty was related to higher levels of symptoms. And again, family support was another variable that was really important in predicting decreases in symptoms. And we've had very similar findings in predicting suicidal thoughts at a follow-up session. And here we found that in addition to internalizing symptoms, predicting those thoughts, we also found that connections between cognitive brain regions predicted lower levels of those thoughts. So in conclusion, we've looked at stress. We've talked a little bit about that and found that different types of stress, especially unpredictable forms and threat-related forms, are the most important predictors of mental health during the teenage years. And that all these dimensions of stress are related to variations in how the body develops in terms of puberty, but also in terms of how the brain develops. We also showed that pubertal status, how one perceives themselves, but also their hormones, is an important predictor of internalizing symptoms, and that physical development is faster in females who are exposed to stress. But this is a sex-dependent sort of thing where males might also show faster pubertal development in the face of stress, but that's not related to symptoms. And finally, we showed that connections between cognitive brain regions is an important predictor of more positive mental health, but that these trajectories of brain development vary as a function of stress. And I just want to leave this one final thought that it's very promising that we're finding that support from peers and from family members plays very important roles in reducing negative mental health symptoms, even if that person has experienced severe forms of stress. And these are some of the items that we've included in this questionnaire. If you're wondering about what are the specific aspects of peer and family support, having a special person around them that they can share their joys and sorrows with, having family that really tries to help them, being able to talk with family members and friends or count on them when things are stressful, and just having family members who are willing to help that person make decisions and guide them through life. These are so important in helping teenagers navigate stress and hopefully reduce those symptoms, even if there are stressful and unforeseen things in the environment. So with that, I would just like to thank my lab and our participants and our funding sources, and take any questions.
That was great. Let's open it up to questions right now. If anyone has a question, feel free to put in the Q&A section or in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, and I'll just enable the speaking feature. Okay, it looks like Adrian Rodriguez has a question, so I'm going to allow you to speak. Here you go. You'll have to unmute yourself. Adrian.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great presentation, Doctor. This is really relevant to me because it's kind of out your scope is teenagers. I experienced some very traumatic experiences from an alcoholic father in my childhood years, and I have mental health issues, depression and anxiety in adulthood. And it's really kind of, I'm a mystery to myself, and I want to know more about like how that very traumatic experience as a kid has kind of affected my brain development, and me as an adult man now trying to grapple with mental health issues and stuff like that, and what the correlation is between traumatic experiences from 3 to 7. Very traumatic experiences, and then kind of the manifestation of those experiences into adulthood. I don't know if I'm articulating my question very well, but it's really fascinating because it's really a lonely place to not know why you are the way you are, and so that's all I got. If that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, it makes lots of sense. You mentioned that those experiences early on, I think you said 3 to 7, we have some work in our lab showing that the timing of these experiences is really important for mental health. And earlier on it's just huge when we're comparing to, experiences that might happen during the teenage years versus the ones that happen in those really formative years of, being an infant, a child, especially, as a person is before they're a teenager, so before they're 10 years old. And we call these sensitive periods. So sensitive periods when they're affected by trauma, and especially when the perpetrator is a family member, we've shown that that has huge effects on mental health and brain development. But I do want to leave you with the promising role that we're finding in resilience is that it's not a fixed concept, or that one person is resilient and another is not, but we're finding that it's something that people can build and that they can learn, and it can be done through peer and other sorts of social support, but also through different sort of cognitive techniques. And that's why I kept talking about the brain's role in especially cognitive regions. We think that there's some really important space there to learn about building resilience. through building our cognitive abilities.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So much. So the other question I have in the Q&A is that I wonder why the family genes was not included as one of the variables to predictor to mental health.
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's a few different ways of doing this, but the most stringent way, the most conservative way would be to use twin studies. With twin studies, if you have twins who are in different environments, then you can control for the genetic aspect and learn about how much was accounted for by the shared genes versus the environment. The issue is usually twins grow up together, so they have a shared environment as well. There is some data out there with twins who have grown up in different environments that would help to tackle this question, but we don't have that data in our lab. And we do have some genetic data, but again, you need really large data sets to understand gene associations on the orders of thousands to 10,000s to really know whether genes are accounting for differences in for example, mental health. And these studies, because our study especially is longitudinal, spanning over 10 years now, it's just not easy to get the funding to get thousands of people in that sort of study.
There's another question here. First, there's a comment that absolutely fascinating research and so well presented. The question is, how are teens selected for your studies to assure that your findings are not biased?
Yeah, in this specific study, we used a community sampling approach. So we had people come in and we screened them, and the only parts that we excluded for are that they have to be able to do an MRI scan. So at the time of enrollment, they were not, didn't have any non-removable metal or anything or any neurological disorders. But other than that, we tried and got a good spread of stressful experiences. That was our second sort of recruiting criteria. And our third is, because we were so interested in puberty, we had to make sure our teens were as close to the early stages of puberty as possible. So females were premenarcheal, meaning they hadn't experienced their first period yet. So those are some of the measures that we took. But that's not to say that we are without bias. Of course, recruiting in the Palo Alto area, which is highly affluent, and having those people who are coming in to volunteer for this study year after year, you do run into the problem that now we have a little bit of sampling bias, because these are the individuals who had an interest in science, the time to commit to a study, and were not of the very low end of socioeconomic status. Palo Alto is a very, like I said, high SES area. So our deprivation measure actually is not going to reflect the whole variation that we might see across the country or in different regions. So I do acknowledge that we have some shortfalls in our study design.
I believe Rosemary has a question, so I'm going to allow you to speak now. There you go. Rosemary, you can unmute yourself.
Ooh, I am wait. I'm not sure. Unmute. Oh, hi.
Yeah.
I am so sorry. I didn't I put my phone in my pocket and I guess it turned it on. But anyway, thank you so much. I also wanted to let the gentleman who asked the question about researching our the first question about researching our history and stuff. I thought that was a really good question and really helpful. So thank you. And thanks for the whole thing. It's great.
Thanks so much, Rosemary.
All right, bye.
There is another question. And the question is, if we were to repeat these studies with young people on the East Coast or in another country, could we expect similar results? Does location play into findings?
Yeah, absolutely. I think location plays into findings. So one aspect of it I had mentioned before was that our deprivation or socioeconomic status measure is not going to have much variability in Palo Alto. But I did mention one study from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So this is the Pittsburgh Girls Study. So I'd shared the results from that. That is from a very low SES background. It's from the Hill District of Pittsburgh. So I used to work with these data. And most of our participants are either Black or from, we probably have 10% who are actually white in that study and 90% are Black. So it gives us differences in demographic factors as well, and race and culture. But luckily we have found convergent findings, very similar findings in terms of the brain aspect and depression trajectories. And we've also found this to be true in our Sacramento sample of Mexican origin youth. But there are differences that I've seen in terms of, levels of SES and those associations with mental health. So I had mentioned earlier that in this study, we didn't find an association between mental health and SES, but we did in those others. So I think definitely the region in which we're sampling from has a huge effect on what we're finding, and we need to be mindful of that and try to include studies that span different areas. And I haven't worked with samples who are outside of the US, but I would imagine that there would be some similarities and some differences. For one thing, we have a community sample here who wasn't selected for specific types of stress, but there are some labs in the US who are sampling for very specific severe forms of stress. For example, institutionalized youth who have experienced neglect to a way higher degree than we have in this sample, or people who were sexually or physically abused and then are no longer with those caretakers. So those are the more homogeneous and more severe samples. And then there are folks who are doing research in different countries to really understand how economic disparities relate to brain development as well.
Thank you for answering that. I don't see any other questions in the chat or the Q&A section. Does anyone have any questions? You can raise your hand or put it in the chat or the Q&A. Okay, I think Catherine, I'm gonna let you unmute yourself. There you go.
Oh, hi. I guess my hand was up and I didn't know it. I just noticed on the on the computer. But I'm actually, I was a behavioral health nurse recently, and very, very informative information that you have given. I love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome, and good luck with your career. You're awesome.
Oh, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. We need more people like you. I'm actually an advocate with mental health also. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for attending.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Catherine. I have Cindy. Cindy, you can unmute yourself. Cindy, were you able to unmute yourself? Okay, I think we're having a problem here.
So we had one question. May I personally reach out to your team? Yes, I put my email in the Q&A. And we had another about, did you have volunteers from East Palo Alto? Yes, we did. We had regions all around Palo Alto, including San Jose and San Francisco. So we did have some variability in our demographics, just not a whole lot.
Okay, so I suppose that's about it. So thank you so much, Dr. Chahal, and really appreciate the presentation and all the information that you shared. I think this is very informative and really helpful for our community. So thank you so much for coming on a Tuesday night and giving us this information. And we hope to see you again soon. And thank you for all those who attended tonight, and have a good rest of the week. Bye, everyone.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all.
I do want to mention that if you do want to watch this presentation again, it's being live streamed on YouTube. So you can go on YouTube and rewatch it on our YouTube channel, which is NAMI Santa Clara County. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.